Very good. Good morning to everybody, all of you on the committee, as well as folks joining us on Zoom. Happy to have your participation. This is a meeting of what I have been calling the GPA Committee, Governance, Policy, and Advocacy. And we will be continuing under that name. This is the meeting for October 14th, 2021. Mr. Barnes, if you'd call the roll, please.
Yes. Mr. Brown,
Here.
Mr. Cole, Dr. Pierce,
Here.
Ms. Klein,
Present.
Ms. Beasley,
Present.
Ms. Ellingson, Mr. Holt, Ms. White.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's call the meeting to order and move on with our agenda. The very first meeting, first item rather, two, is taken off the agenda for today. We'll do it at the next meeting. Those minutes are just not ready yet. And that reminds me to let you all know that Misty, who had been staffing us since our beginning, is moving on and doing more important things. She's valuable. She's outstanding. No, she's going to stay within Columbus City Schools. She's still going to be in the administrative offices and doing more and more work, but she simply won't be staffing this committee. Instead, we have James Barnes, who is our general counsel, and he will help provide some even better insight to some of our policy matters, and he'll be doing all the things that Eric Rausch once did for us and Misty did for us. So welcome, James. The first item on the on the agenda is Board Policy 2421. You should all have a copy in front of you. And this is dealing with career and technical education, otherwise known as CTE. To help get us started and do some presentation is Ed O'Reilly. Mr. O'Reilly? And Kenny Lee.
Thank you, members of the GPA committee, Board Member Pierce, Board Member Brown. We're honored to be here to share an update on Board Policy 2421 on career technical education. This is an update that ODE asks every district who provides career technical education to provide every 5 years to update their policy. And so you can see the policy, the last policy adoption was on May 5th, 2015, and now we are providing the updates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. O'Reilly.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. The Career Tech Education Program policy is really, we redo this every 5 years to make sure we're in alignment with current ODE programming language. It's really just a level set. When they change career fields, then we make sure we reflect those career fields on this policy. They've changed a lot with work-based learning. We make sure our policy reflects those changes in work-based learning. And those are probably the two biggest pieces that you see on this policy. Other than that, it's getting rid of some old language. Nobody calls this vocational education anymore. There's no need to list that on a policy at this stage. It is career technical education. And we want to ensure that that language is solid. So other than that, it's just some minor language changes to ensure that we align with Ohio Department of Education.
Thank you. I guess let me ask and then open it up to the committee. what you've described is mainly cleanup. Is there anything substantively changing in your recommendations?
Some of the things that really struck us as we're working through this and updating this to align to ODE's language is, for example, like Mr. O'Reilly mentioned, removing the term vocational from the policy, which we know is dated. Another interesting and nice call it is expanding the secondary career technical education for students. Originally, in the last policy was 11 and 12. We're expanding that down to grades 7 through 12 and being very intentional now in expanding career exposure and beginning the pathway work as early as middle school. So that is a good call out. I also think when you look at some of the language that's used, we're promoting, and this aligns to some of the grant work that we have going on at CT. We use the word equity or equitability and accessibility in both using that term and expanding access to these very important programs that, again, are not seen in that historical lens of vocational, that this is not for students who are college bound. CT programs are certainly now for students who are college bound, whether it's a 2-year path or a 4-year path. Courses, these pathways, these programs, or for all different types of students, and it really opens doors for a lot of our Oklahoma City school students.
Thank you. Dr. Pierce.
So I have a couple of questions. As we look at some of the language that has been striked out of the policy, specifically G, H, and P, so marketing and finance, has that been collapsed into business and administrative services? Where's cosmetology at?
It's a great question, Dr. Pierce. Yes, cosmetology is now folded into human services under K.
Okay.
And then finance is actually a program that fits under business, but we also talked about finance and some of the other strike-throughs with marketing is also opportunities that students can access through College Credit Plus and other business courses in our schools.
That's excellent, that they can access those through College Credit Plus, but I'm very focused on what we offer in terms of our vocational programs. So in that regard, have those programs been moved and folded into business? Where are those programs situated within the language of this update?
So with finance, actually, the actual finance program was sunsetted several years ago due to lack of enrollment. But we've really targeted business opportunities through moving a lot of those FTEs back into buildings. You'll see a lot of Microsoft Office Suite training and as part of the business training. But the finance program right now is not being offered. The language in here, though, is permissive. It says that these programs are not limited to work. It's not limited to these. So finance is a need and a desire that can be added in without changing the language of the policy.
And where does marketing stand?
Marketing would be under the same kind of guidance if, due to numbers and demand, a school were to want to develop that pathway. We could certainly do so. The language allows us to have that flexibility.
But there's not currently a formal marketing program.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. So we do not have a formal program.
Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. To that comment that you just made about these available courses with business specifically, one of those buildings would be Eastmore Academy, correct? Are there any other places where we actually have those courses being taken? And I really want to stress too, to Dr. Pierce's point, is the importance of knowing that these things are available very directly, I think will help spark that interest that we're looking for in terms of enrollment into these courses. But Eastmore would be one of those. Can you give me just a few others?
So under Business Administrative Services, currently we have pathways at Briggs, Mifflin, Walnut Ridge, and West. Those are complete pathways. But obviously business courses are offered across the secondary organization.
And is it just those pathways are offered in those schools because of, personnel expertise,
Exactly.
available instructors?
Yep.
And student request as well.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
My next question, I had an additional
Go ahead.
question. When we talk about this being updated 7th through 12th grade, it's been my firsthand experience with my children that the 7th grade and the 8th grade exposure is literally a week-long summer camp. Are we going to literally do some things in the curriculum to increase the exposure beyond the week-long summer camp?
Absolutely, Dr. Pearson. And we actually, our intention is to, even though from a secondary standpoint and from an OD definition standpoint, we have grades 7 through 12, we want to expand career advising and advocacy K-12. And so even though 7-12 is specifically called out in the policy for ODE purposes, as a district, we're looking to embed career exposure and advising as early as kindergarten. So to your question, yes, we definitely want to expand that middle school advocacy, advising, exposure, and broaden that out through not just curricula, but really intentional programming.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
And the state funding model has changed to allow for money from career tech to go to 7-12.
Okay, so we have resources to support this language change. Excellent.
Great. Eileen?
Can you tell me a little bit more about the work-based learning program that is identified towards the end of the policy?
Yes.
You want to talk? And I'll
Yeah,
hand
sure.
out.
The work-based learning program, formerly known as work study, it leverages partnerships, and so that we would, the goal is to provide students with an opportunity to have really authentic experiences where they learn and work at the same time. And so you can see here that it's our goal to provide these authentic learning experiences, because we know from experience these are things that students that they want. They want to be able to apply what they're learning in classrooms into actual settings. And so I'll give you an example. With our JP Morgan Chase grant that we have in CTE, we are explicitly calling out work-based learning in healthcare and IT fields. And we are building out an infrastructure and systems to really expand student opportunities in those two particular paths, but certainly not limiting work-based learning to those two paths. But those are what JP Morgan Chase, the grant, defines as high-wage, high-demand jobs.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. So the reason that I'm asking this is because I have been working, maybe not quite so diligently because I have other responsibilities, but have been working with adult education to talk about mass appraisal as a career. For those of you who don't know, I serve as the Chief of Staff to the Franklin County Auditor's Office, and one of the things that I've found in the 2 years, 9 months that Auditor Centiano has been there is that mass appraisal is not a very diverse field, and I would like to increase the diversity to help in the mass appraisal process. So I would be interested in following up with both of you about whether or not mass appraisal is more appropriate for adult education, more appropriate for a work-based learning environment, or some other pathway in order to get an opportunity before our students that mass appraisal doesn't require a college degree. So it would be a way to get people at a young age into that career field that traditionally has just been passed down family to family, honestly. So
Yeah, and I would add that to your point, that's one of the benefits of work-based learning is that if you can work with a student, let's say their junior or senior year, and provide them with the skills and the training, when they graduate from Columbus City Schools, and like you said, the position doesn't require a college degree, they could join you as soon as they graduate. And the nice thing is that we've really closed the training window, right? That they've already been with you for 2 years. They know the ins and outs. They can start right away in a great position.
Probably the key component to that is at the 11th, 12th grade level, is there an industry credential tied to that? Because that's an important part of the K-12 experience, is earning that industry credential. When there's no credential tied to it, then it becomes more of a, how can adult ed assist you? And I know we've had some conversations about that, and hopefully they will continue.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else at the table? Any questions from any of those online? I understand that there may be some. Hearing none, hearing nothing. Let me ask a couple of questions, and this does not mean that that I necessarily favor these things, but I just wanted to ask. With respect to the names, and I certainly understand taking the word vocational out. And at the same time, many of us grew up with what we know as vocational education. We've gotten into a habit, some of us. I know it was mentioned earlier in one of our very first questions. I wonder whether it would make sense to simply include formerly known as vocational, or something of that sort, just to help make sure that the parents and others looking at this would know what they're looking at. And the same thing with that last portion, formerly known as work study. Something like that might be useful. The second item has to do with the items in the A through P list that were taken out, namely finance, cosmetology, and marketing. Because those were considered and are considered areas that we'd like to have students, and we've now kind of relocated them without identifying them, would it make sense to, let's see, if finance is under business and administrative services, maybe we say in C, including finance, and the same thing for cosmetology and marketing. Actually, that one would be including finance and marketing in item C. Any thoughts on either of those?
So the Ohio Department of Education makes distinguishes between career fields and programs. So those things that are listed there are actually career fields. So cosmetology is a program that fits under a field. Mm-hmm. So we have, I think, 35, 36 different programs. So if we went that route with cosmetology, then do we list all of those other 35 under the subset of, here's what's in arts and communication, here's what's under construction technologies, that type of thing. So this list is just listing the career fields as designated by ODE.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me.
And do you have the Ohio, and Mr. Chair, do you have the Ohio Revised Code? I'm having some site issues, but do you have the Ohio Revised Code that would otherwise cite that at the top here, or cite it somewhere?
In terms of referring to the...
Referring to what you just alluded to regarding career fields versus programs. we should cite some?
I don't believe that's codified. I believe it's, simply how ODE lists those items.
So if there's some sort of administrative guideline that might cite it, I think that would be helpful for the sake of this policy, number one. But we'll also have collateral materials, yes, that cite our 36 programs.
We already have those, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right.
And there are code sections listed at the end of the policy, as we do with many others, both administrative and revised code. And I don't know to what, I have not pulled those out and looked, but imagine they cover much of this.
Board Member Brown, may I speak to the vocational
Sure.
term? Yeah, it's an interesting time in career technical education where, we are trying to attract more and more students to the program, and we're actually, through our JP Morgan Chase grant, working with Warhol and Wall Street to create messaging around that. And one of the things they're finding is that some families view vocational as, I get out of high school and I go to work and I'm done with my education. And what we're trying to paint is a career pathway where you could go to work out of high school if that's a family need, but you also have opportunities to then re-engage back into the community colleges or even a four-year university. So we're really trying to actually get away from that thought of I graduate, I work, and you're in a pathway, if that makes some sense.
Yes, it does. Further questions, Emily?
Yes, I have some questions about two changes involving students with disabilities and access to the program. The first I wanted to ask you about was under P, there is a section that says the board directs that any efforts to recruit students to participate. And there's a strikeout for students with disabilities in a format and context in which they communicate. I agree, that is incredibly awkward way of saying effectively communicate with students with disabilities. But I'm not sure if simply saying focusing on equity and accessibility for students is sufficient either, without spelling out what that accessibility looks like. And in terms of substance, I just had some thoughts and comments on that. I mean, it is important to ensure that students with disabilities will know that their needs are met for any workplace settings, that if they have a mobility impairment, that the site is going to be physically accessible, and if they have an intellectual disability or a sensory disability, that literally everything that they do is going to be accessible. And there are going to be some pieces of that where the school is going to have obligations over and above what an employer would have because of the differing responsibilities under the law. But I'm just wondering if that part could be workshopped a little bit and have a little bit more specifics on how, on what accessibility and equity would look like for students with disabilities. And the reason that's so important is because still today, a lot of our students with disabilities, with sensory disabilities and with intellectual disabilities, end up in segregated workplaces, like sheltered workshops, where you're basically doing, light hand assembly for minimum wage, thank God, not sub-minimum wage like we had in the past. But these career pathways are all going to be incredibly important. And of course, every kid with a disability has individual needs and interests, so they're not all going to want to do the same or one program, but knowing up front that any workplace is going to be accessible, that if you're blind, you're going to have accessible technology in the workplace, that you're literally going to be able to get in the door if you have a mobility impairment, is incredibly important. I do like the part about having an agreement signed that the employer will follow the non-discrimination policy of the district. But again, I'm not sure if that non-discrimination policy is more of what we will not do. But for students with disabilities, there has to be a little bit more an assurance that accommodations will be provided, services and supports to provide that individual education will be provided. I also kind of tripped over the learning programs will be available without regard to, and then race, color, national origin, and then also disability. But for disability, it can't be without regard to. Real equity and inclusion is going to be, making those programs actually functionally accessible to students with disabilities, and not just on the recruitment end, but on the actual, doing the work. But other than that, I see that you've targeted the parts of the language that are awkward, but I think you could go a little bit further on those pieces.
Thank you for the feedback. Absolutely.
I have a question that I think aligns and connects to that. So understanding that these corrections were literally coming from ODE, right? So I'm not sure how much you all actually massaged it or just literally took the language and said, here's what we need to update. So I'm coming at these remarks and next questions with that perspective. So is that perspective accurate?
The language was really focused on aligning to ODE, but I think to some of the feedback we're getting from the group, it can be massaged and feedback taken and incorporated into the policy.
So I guess this question would probably be for Dr. Barnes, for Council Barnes. So is it more appropriate to massage or put that type of language related to the accessibility of these types of programs in this policy, or should we revisit our equity policy and really think about the language that we have in that policy and ensure that it includes our work-based programs? So, and then also with that in mind, would it also be appropriate to think about including this language, not so much in the policy, but in the administrative guidelines that go with this policy? So where's the best place for us to really place the language that will have the appropriate impact? I don't want the language to just be put in the policy and us to lose it. If it will be put in administrative guidelines and then our board can accurately get reports, and when we get our academic monitoring, it can be shown to us. I want to know where that impact is going to happen.
My initial thought is that it should be in the policy that specifically discusses the programs,
Okay.
which would be this policy.
Anything further, Emily?
Sure, just following up on what Dr. Pierce said, another area that we might want to look at might be in the partnerships that that CCS has with other entities, and I'm thinking specifically of our vocational rehabilitation system, Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. Because the programming that they have and the resources they have, aligning and making sure that everyone's person-centered planning from the IPE to the IEP all align is really important, and that's where the whole team gets together, the rubber meets the road, and we make sure that everybody knows what their role is and what they must bring to the table to make sure the student succeeds.
So I think if we were to go down that road, the appropriate recommendation would be to bring Dr. Blue to the table to be able to help with those partnerships, to help with the language that needs to go into this particular policy.
Anything more? Anybody on Zoom? Hearing nothing. What I'd suggest, subject to the rest of the committee, is that Ed and Kenny have heard all of our comments and I think understand them. Perhaps we let them have some more time to work those things into a new draft to present to us probably at our next meeting for adoption. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Will that work?
That works, and I think the board member Pierce's comment and really kind of expanding out some of the people that we talked to, including Dr. Blue, reaching out to some of our partners to get some feedback. We can certainly do that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The next policy we get to look at again. This has been before us a number of times, and we even had a subcommittee work on parts of this. It was presented to the board at its last meeting, and I believe, and certainly Dr. Pierce or Mr. Cole will be able to correct me if they understood it differently. But I believe everything that is here is acceptable to the board. I didn't hear anything with that. The one item that did arise from one of our board members, from Ramona Reyes, was whether we want to include language that specifically describes how or when we might respond to those things that we hear at the meeting. Dr. Pierce?
Just point of correction, there were two things that were given in the board meeting. One was by Vice President Reyes in terms of when we respond. The second was from me in terms of the accessibility that we provide for public comment related to interpreters and related to sign language. So those were the two issues that were brought.
All right. Given that those are the topics, and I believe we can stick to just those two topics, does anybody have any thoughts?
Mine was, initially, what would be considered reasonable time for response? That was the question that I had in mind. Is that, a week? Is that 48 hours? What exactly constitutes for us reasonable time for a response to a public concern or comment?
Others?
Following that meeting, Dr. Dixon made the commitment that she would get back to us with a reasonable time frame that was appropriate for administration. Have we received any word back from administration on some thoughts or ideas?
No, not to my knowledge. And I can certainly talk with her.
Can we ask here? So an invitation did go out to Dr. Chapman this morning and to a couple of days ago. So maybe if one of our administrators that's online, is Kira still online? If she has an idea. Is she gone now? There she goes.
Dr. Pierce, I'm here.
Awesome. Do you have an idea of an appropriate timeline if maybe one was discussed in cabinet following that board meeting?
We have not discussed it in cabinet, but I will certainly bring this up to Monique to put it on as a cabinet agenda item moving forward, to offer this group some ideas and guidance moving forward.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts? I think that those things make sense, and to let the administration guide us on what is reasonable time makes sense. I would suggest that time frame be one by which administration will follow up, but not necessarily the time that they'll have it fully resolved. By that I mean, if it takes more time to actually, figure it out or do something, that's fine, but we want administration to at least contact that person and say, yeah, we've got it, we're working on it, perhaps here are the issues, can you help with that? Something of that sort, rather than, that it needs to be completed by that particular date. Emily?
Could I ask a question that is partially founded on my lack of knowledge about what the specific issues that folks are contacting about? But I just wanted to make an observation as a public member, I guess, and somebody who has emailed the board or contacted folks. And there have been times whenever I've sent a communication that I thought was a one-way street. Here's how I think about this policy, but I'm not expecting a response back. And yet many times I do get a response back surprisingly quick, and that's wonderful. But I just wonder if there might be an option to conserve resources for folks who just want to convey a message versus triaging from folks who are expecting a response. And some responses that folks are expecting might not necessarily be something that needs to come from the board. My bus is late again is not one that, which you might have been hearing, is not one that necessarily, you know, the board can immediately respond to. But it's still important. I'm just food for thought out there, though, that guiding folks to understand what to expect whenever they make a communication will be just as important as how they're received and processed on the back end.
Yeah, to Emily's point, I having not been involved in the board meeting where this was discussed, I guess I'm trying to figure out, is this an acknowledgement that you've been heard? Or is this a, yes, we're going to actually handle this particular issue that you've brought before us? Because not every idea that comes is going to be one that can be implemented for a myriad of reasons. And so I'm trying to discern, are we talking about just an acknowledgement that you've been heard, we've considered it, we're not moving forward, or is it more of a action?
Cole?
Thank you, Chair. It's interestingly, I would think, a combination of the two, but more weighted in the idea that, one, first of all, fundamentally, the Board of Education, in that of, you know, our body, politic, is going to be responsive to particular requests or needs from the community, because we at the table can't necessarily deal with that. Most of the things that we're confronted with are uniquely tailored to, you know, the administration itself and remediation to that effect. So the idea that they're going to come here and necessarily get something from us immediately is just not possible, unless, of course, the superintendent or someone on staff has the ability to answer that question right then and there. Most of the instances in which we've been engaged have really involved those types of things. I have a problem with my son's class, and, you know, I've talked to the teacher about this. It's a behavior issue. It's not been addressed. I want some redress to that effect. And then we make it incumbent of the administration to handle it. Today's conversation is really around, in part, not just how we communicate it with sign language or foreign lingua franca, right? But also how we commit to a time by which this will be addressed. So in most cases, it's that. A lot of folks do come, as you just stated, to make their voices heard on a matter. Sometimes it's many of our students who have that, but they also have some sort of redress that they like to follow that too. So it's kind of either or, but I think your concern, if I'm hearing it right, it sounds as if your concern is really around also the idea of us kind of chasing rabbits down a hole and wasting resources. And as I see it in practice, we really haven't done that, as I've seen it. I think the administration has leveraged some measure of discretion to help identify that. But that's where we create the guardrails in the policy and then allow them administratively to address that. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think that's a fair interpretation, but I guess I would also caution us in one. Most of the issues that in my short term on the board I have seen be brought to us really point to systematic, structural limitations and deficiencies that the board has to deal with. So understanding that we cannot make those types of changes very quickly, I think the goal or the way in which the question was posed by Vice President Reyes was that within a particular amount of time, can we commit to connecting that speaker with the appropriate district administrator, right? And so one of the things that was really great that happened during that meeting was we had comment from community member Stephen Hardwick. He's a parent in the district. And Dr. James, who is our new COO, actually got up and gave his business card and said, give me a call, let's talk about this, let's solve it. And so I think that sense of urgency is the type of sense of urgency we need to have with all public comments. Who are we immediately connecting that speaker to so the issue can be addressed? I think that could reasonably happen within 24 to 48 hours of the public comments being made. That gives administration enough time to determine whose lane an issue or a topic falls into, and to be able to convene those individuals together to craft a message back. Whether or not that's appropriate in terms of administration actually being able to do that, I'm not sure. They might have a particular meeting on a Thursday, so they might have a particular meeting on a Wednesday, so that 24 to 48 hour time span might not work. I don't know.
Emily?
I've just got I guess an observation and a proposal. What worries me about folks going straight to the top is, number one, not everybody knows to contact the board about things. Number two, the quality of information that you've gotten is not going to be, you're going to get one person's perspective of what an issue is without getting full, stakeholder, all of that. And instead of resolving things at kind of the lowest possible level, you've kind of jumped to the top, which I would hate to be like a teacher or an administrator, on the receiving end of a complaint that could have been resolved if it had been resolved at a lower level. But as a parent too, if I've got an issue and I just literally don't know who to go to except, my neighbors at the pickup line that I'm complaining with, and it just seems like being a little bit more clear about what the dispute resolution process would be. Maybe creating one that's informal, that basically says, what's your issue? What have you tried to do to resolve it? And what would you like to see happen? Just to capture that information, capture what those issues are. And that way the appropriate staff could triage, but it might be something that's, a fight between two kids. It might be an issue with a teacher. It might be an issue with a principal. It might be, you know what I'm saying? Like, I hear what you're saying on the triage, but it just strikes me that's a lot of work, and it's done at a weird level with not a lot of information if it's going directly to the board.
I think that's a great feedback. We have discussed that as a board, looking at the form that individuals fill out when they do sign up to speak, so we can immediately begin to do that triage work. And so that's why I think, again, with this policy, giving the administration 24 to 48 hours to pinpoint whether they're sending that parent back to the school and say, talk to the principal about this issue, or they're sending the parent to the regional AD to say, how can we resolve this issue? That might be, maybe there's contention or conflict between the principal and the regional AD needs to step in to mediate. But we're giving the administration the flexibility to kind of get together and huddle and say, how do we need to address this issue within the next 24 to 48 hours to pinpoint who that speaker needs to talk to.
Sure, just if I could just follow up, if there was something like a form that instead of just saying, go to customer service for everything, if there was something to say, do you have an issue with the district? Do you have a comment you want to make? Do you have feedback you want to make? Is it with the district as a whole? Is it with my building? Is it with my principal? Is it with my teacher? And then what have I done to address it? And do I expect a response? Just buttons that you could click to sort of help the folks who are trying to convey that information get you the information and help guide it where they also think that it might need to be addressed. Because literally not everything needs to be addressed by the board. And it's probably better addressed at the lowest possible level. But giving folks an outlet where they know how they can make a complaint that doesn't involve finding out when the next board meeting is and signing up to be a public speaker would be a great thing for all involved, probably.
Yes, and that's exactly what we've discussed. Updating and revising that form so we can help to triage before it gets to us. Excellent.
That's great. Michael, did you still have?
Yes, just very quickly. So there's interestingly, because I hear what you're saying, Emily, I do. There's interestingly in all of our policies where there's reference directly to the superintendent, it is not necessarily the superintendent in role, right? It is not addressed to Dr. Dixon or whoever would sit in that seat. It is the superintendent and his or her emissaries, right? Those folks that work directly with the superintendent. So I want you to think of superintendent as you see it in our policies as something very broad. The superintendent shall, the superintendent, must, or what have you. In many instances, it's something that refers to that role in person, and many others, it's something that broadly allows the superintendent leverage to have a representative address something. So I want to make sure you guys really understand and are clear with that. The other side is, again, kind of adding another cornerstone to what Dr. Pierce is saying. This is an opportunity for folks. This policy doesn't negate in any way, shape, form, or fashion a parent, a concerned community member, a partner, the opportunity to make direct relationship, going back to that word superintendent, to make direct relationship with the organization at any level. It doesn't. It doesn't preclude that at all. What this is doing is giving us a very clear set of protocols and guidelines, guardrails around how the community will come to us, approach us, and how we will do the preliminary information gathering to ensure that we are as effective and impactful, ideally, in dealing with the public at a time that we're approached about something. And we know some folks will come to us about lasers. There was a fellow who used to come to the board meeting and talk about lasers in his head and shooting out of his eyes, and he was concerned. And then there are people who come with real serious issues, and there are folks who just want to hear, want to be heard. We've over the years found many effective ways and continue to address those types of situations. But we wanted to make sure in this policy specifically that we had all these things cited out, and now coming back to the table to say what is a reasonable time by which we will, should somebody need to be addressed, should the board request it, what's a reasonable time by which they will get a response. I hope I'm helpful, but this is really, it's not something that's just saying you guys got to come all the way to the top. It's saying that should you come all the way to the top and raise it in front of any one of us, then Dr. So-and-so, we need to make this happen. We're concerned about this issue. You have XYZ amount of time, you have 5 business days, whatever, to address this situation.
If I may, I really think, though, that if you focused on that intake system and really think through the IT, think through, presenting folks the options so that they can understand.
That is duly noted, and that's a part of the process,
Because
as also alluded to.
That will also allow you to capture data about what people are concerned about. Like, how many of those are going to be, my bus is late again? Or, but how many also are going to say, I think Cause needs a new building?
We have
You're
over.
going to address that in 5
No, I hear
days?
you. We
Yeah.
actually have over 40 some odd people right now working in customer service who their job is to actually collect that information. We put out surveys. We do a myriad melange of things to ensure that we're clear about what issues are that we're typically engaging. And we're bringing on new people to actually help on the family side to strengthen that engagement side of it. So you're absolutely correct. This doesn't, we got a lot of stuff already in play that, as you guys said earlier, because you're not totally aware of what the nuances are, who is coming to us with what kind of information or concern. We have a lot of these structures already in place. Right now, this is fine-tuning that board engagement side of it that says, what's a reasonable time by which you're going to make a response to this concerned citizen?
I guess I would just say that if the board thinks it's important to put a time limit in policy for their response to public comment, then I look forward to hearing from the administration what that time limit or what that time parameter is. I'm also going to note that Columbus City Council doesn't have a time for response. The Ohio General Assembly doesn't have a time for response for public comments. And I don't know that it's necessary, but if it's important to this board and the board thinks that it needs those parameters, then they should be able to implement it. On Dr. Pierce's other topic, which is accessibility and having interpreters available for the public comment, I think that absolutely should be added to the policy.
I think that a couple things. One is to the second part of what Joellen mentioned. I'm totally in agreement, and I think that that's something that I don't know if there's anything different that needs to go into this policy or elsewhere, and I think we should identify the best place to include that, because accessibility is important in everything we do. And we should, review this and make, an improvement that will cover not only this, but everything. And secondly, on the first point, that is the time to respond, at least to me, I don't think that we need to include anything on that. It's good customer service that we want throughout the district, including from administrators with respect to people that speak at board meetings. And the more time goes by, the less satisfied that person will be, and the less satisfied the public will be. And providing good customer service is always important. And I don't know of a body that has adopted a time for response. I think if we do it all, that it should be fairly simple and say that anybody who comes before the board with comments should receive an administrative response within a week, or whatever time frame administration gives us. I don't know that we're in a position to say what that reasonable time can be, but I welcome hearing back from administration about that. But simply to say that they will receive a response and would allow for administration to say, thank you for your comments, we heard you, or to say, here's how we're going to resolve your question, or here's who we want to connect you to for follow-up. Just leaving that open, but saying that there will be something. You will hear from the administration within a week. Might be helpful and might address the issue that was raised. Any further thoughts?
Yes, definitely. So I do think that the policy should be updated to include language around ADA accommodations. So specifically where we say that any person or group wishing to speak on an agenda item shall register by email or phone through the Office of Customer Relations their intent to speak no later than 3:30 p.m. We could also include language around their intent to speak and request for ADA accommodations.
I think that can do it.
Does that accommodate folks who may not have English as their first language, an ADA accommodation?
That's a good point.
So there are some tools that are available via YouTube and some other places that allow translation services, supports.
I
the
guess my
administration
question
would look into that.
is would putting that language in, would we also need to add language that says a request for a foreign language interpreter or something like that?
Yes.
In order for
do
them to give their comments at the board meeting, they need a foreign language interpreter to be able to relay those comments to the board.
Okay.
I like that.
Well, we could say, as part of that, request any special accommodations that may be needed, including ADA.
Okay, so, and request for accommodations. including. So right now I have their intent to speak and request for special accommodations, including language interpretation
Or ADA.
or ADA. So then, I guess I would like to make a motion that policy 0169.1 be revised, specifically the sentence starting with any person or group wishing to speak. When we get down to the element of the sentence, their intent to speak and request for special accommodations, including language interpretation or ADA, no later than 3:30 p.m. on the day of the meeting.
Second.
It's a long sentence.
Comment, further discussion?
I would recommend that we just use the word reasonable accommodation, because I
Thank
think
you.
that covers both, because special doesn't really exist in ADA land.
Reasonable.
Is
So I'm fine with updating or revising my motion to say reasonable accommodations instead of special accommodations.
Yes.
Second.
Got it. Anything further? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, that item is passed as a revision to this policy for recommendation to the board. And what about the time for response item?
Mr. Chair, I would recommend that this committee wait to hear from administration as to what that reasonable time for response is, and then put this bylaw, it's a bylaw, on the agenda for the next meeting with that addition.
That would be fine. I saw that Kira has rejoined us, and timing just suggests to me that you may have something more to say.
No, I was just showing that I'm here and still listening and absolutely connect with Misty moving forward regarding that timeline
Thank you.
and feedback from the
Appreciate it.
leadership team. Yep, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if I may, in advance, Ms. Kira, if you would be able to, query the administration, not only regarding the time piece, but also the reasonable resources piece, that idea of that allocation, particularly given the time that we're putting on that by 3:30 or whatever that time is. If you can have that kind of conversation with them too about what reasonable accommodations could even be turned around as quickly as 2 hours, I think that'd be helpful too. If there's only one concern I have with this that part of the language of the policy is time. Is
I
it
agree.
possible?
Or better
Yes,
yet,
I
how can
agree.
we make it possible? What resources do we need to have on speed dial that are ready and available? We have schools with deaf students and deaf families in them. We should always have those resources available for any events that we do. We have a very multilingual community. We should always have those resources available.
Thank you. Kira, you understand what the committee is looking for?
Yes, I do. And I'd like to say that with our interpreters, either for our hearing impaired interpreters or our language interpreters, we do have great teams that are responsive and planned for anything from small meetings to after school functions, open houses, so that parents have accessibility or caregivers and can participate fully with their student. But I understand the ask, and I look forward to talking to the team about it.
Thank you.
Anything more on this? We're going to hold it for the response and hopefully pick this up at our next meeting. Our next meeting, by the way, is on the 11th of November at 8:30, and that happens to be Veterans Day. Anything further for the committee's attention? We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Without opposition, we're adjourned.
I was just asking.
I'm sorry.
Who made the motion?
Board Member Cole made the motion. I seconded. No opposition came from
Passed
Chair
by
Brown,
acclamation.
and we're good.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity to be back together and see you all in person.
Yes, yes.
Bye, Kelsey.
Chairman Brown, I okay.
And we've never done that here, I don't think.
Cole, yes.
Fine, yes.
Everybody's.
Everybody said yes.
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 Beasley, yes.
I say yes.
Okay.